I told you that hospitals probably wouldn't exist the way they do today? What if I told you that human rights, the value of every individual, the abolition of the Gladiator games, the campaign against slavery, the protection of abandoned children, and even the idea that every person possesses inherent dignity didn't simply evolve? Many people today believe Christians delayed human progress. They point to the Crusades, the Inquisition, or the so-called Dark Ages, and conclude the world would be centuries ahead if Christianity had never existed. But what if history tells the opposite story? What if many of the values modern skeptics cherish are themselves products of the Christian worldview? Well, hi everyone, I'm Lenny Esposito, and in this episode we're going to look at what historians, not just theologians, say about Christianity's influence on civilization. We'll examine whether Christianity really held the world back, or whether it became the single greatest force for advancing human dignity the world has ever known. That's all coming up on this. Come, let us reason together. Well, hi all. Welcome again to another Come Let Us Reason Together. And today I want to tackle a question. Are we worse because of Christianity? This was brought up in one of the internet forums that I read from time to time, and I thought it was an important question to tackle. Now, is the world worse because of Christianity? Many atheists think so. They hold to the idea that because people clung to what they consider a backward superstition, that human suffering increased, rights were trampled, human development was stifled, and knowledge was quenched. One popular meme, in fact, shows a supposed gap in the human scientific achievement during the so-called Dark Ages between AD 500 and AD 1500. That's when the church was the central power and the social institution that affected all of Europe. In fact, a recent meme posted in this group, which includes both Christians and atheists, echoed the sentiment well, using the Family Guy characters Huey and Brian. In it, you see Brian asking, "Where are we?" as he walks down the street. Huey smugly responds, "We're in the same time, but in this universe, Christianity never existed. This humanity is 1,000 years more advanced." Now, aside from the grammatical errors in the meme itself, let's take a look at this accusation, because it would be easy to dismiss internet atheists as reactionary, but the assertion, it does show up in a more sophisticated form across more influential channels. For example, take this article from popular Los Angeles Times columnist Steve Lopez. He was reflecting on a church service he saw and his agnosticism. And he says, "Could my stubborn resistance to faith be slipping? Oh, no way. Religious fervor has done an awful lot of harm in the world, dividing people, sparking wars, producing an endless parade of charlatans and hustlers." Quite a big claim for Lopez. I wonder what he's comparing it against. Other atheists have made other types of claims. For example, that Christianity has caused so many deaths because it's a religion. In fact, new atheist Sam Harris, in his book, Letter to a Christian Nation, concludes by not merely dismissing Islam and some of the havoc and terrorism that it sits truly at its feet, but then asks the following. He writes, quote, "Non-believers like myself stand beside you, Christian, dumbstruck by the Muslim hordes who chant death to whole nations of the living. But we stand dumbstruck by you as well, by your denial of tangible reality, by the suffering you create in service to your religious myths, and by your attachment to an imaginary God." Do we create suffering in service to our religious myths? One of the other claims that we read is that there are more wars caused by religion than any other motive. Now, we've talked about that before, but I'll bring it up again here. Richard Dawkins also gets in on the idea in his book where he writes, "The time has come for people of reason to say enough is enough. Religious faith discourages independent thought. It's divisive and it's dangerous, he writes in The Root of All Evil. Are these claims true? Is Christianity stifling knowledge? Does religion negate all that is dignified in a human being? In fact, that's what Karl Marx held. This is a really important concept, too, because you have to remember that right now, Marx's writings are becoming very influential among those of the academic set, especially young college kids. And he said religion negates all that is dignified in a human being by rendering them servile and more amenable to accepting the status quo. In other words, religion is the opiate of the people, as his famous quote. So as communism becomes more popularized and Marx's ideas gain more traction, does that mean that more people are going to believe that religion somehow dumbs you down and makes you easy to control? What about other claims? How about the subjugation of women? Atheists United writers Julia Hernandez and Al Seckel said this, quote, "Throughout its history, the Christian religion has deprived women of their right to be treated as equal human beings." Wow, quite a claim. Now, I agree beliefs have consequences. And if we examine different belief systems, look at their history, especially those places where the development of that system is paramount in the society, you can see the consequences that come from it. Islam, for example, you can see the brutality of Muhammad reflected in his followers as Islam sweeps across vast swaths of the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, even through Spain, in order to conquest and convert by edge of the sword. Their brutality, their terrorism, the subjugation of women and veiling them are all on full display. Hinduism also shows the consequence of its system. The caste system, for example, is a direct outworking of the idea of reincarnation. The idea that if you're born into a specific class, you do not get to move up or you do not get to move down. You are stuck in that class and you are relegated to do the tasks of whatever that class is, even if your class is the Dalits, the untouchables. Of course, if you're a aristocratic Hindu man and you die, then your wife should be thrown on a funeral pyre and burned alive with you. And there's the internal contradictions that fall within Hinduism that make the religion very anti-logical in certain respects. But let's not even look at faith systems. Communism, we talked about Marx, it also carries a certain belief system, and it also carries consequences. For example, government becomes the primary power broker. It's government who decides what equal looks like. Once you have a communistic system, really, there's no incentive to excel. You don't get rewarded for your effort. Everybody gets equal output. And therefore, why should I bother putting more in than the next person? In fact, people and tasks become genericized within a communistic regime, and poverty and despair always increase. So we can look at different belief systems, different worldviews, and historically understand what effects they have. Well, let's look at Christianity. What are the effects of Christian beliefs on humanity? Because we do have a before and after. We have the era before Christianity existed, and we have the era after. Matter of fact, we set our calendars by it. So what are the effects of Christian beliefs? Well, first of all, and most importantly, Christianity raises the worth of the individual. It's human value. Christianity put human value in a place where it had never been before. The sanctity of human life really only came to full fruition within the Christian tradition. Now, let me give you an example of this. Tom Holland, who is a historian, very popular podcast that he has called The Rest is History. When he was researching this, he was always fascinated by the Greek and the Roman cultures. He thought these were part of the zenith of human achievement. But as he began to really dig into them in order to do his research, he found something different. And in his book Dominion, he writes, quote, "When I came to write my first works of history, I chose as my themes the two periods that had always most stirred and moved me as a child, the Persian invasions of Greece and the last decades of the Roman Republic. The years that I spent writing these twin studies of the classical world, living intimately in the company of Leonidas and of Julius Caesar, of the hoplites who had died at Thermopylae, and of the legionnaires who had crossed the Rubicon, but only confirmed me in my fascination for Sparta and Rome, even when subjected to the minutest historical enquiry, retained their glamour as apex predators. They continued to stalk my imaginings as they had always done, like a great white shark, like a tiger, like a tyrannosaur. Yet, giant carnivores, however wondrous, are by their nature terrifying. The more years I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, so the more alien I increasingly found it. The values of Leonidas, whose people had practiced a peculiarly murderous form of eugenics and had trained their young to kill uppity Ubermenschen by night, were nothing that I recognized as my own, nor were those of Caesar, who was reported to have killed 1,000,000 Gauls and enslaved 1,000,000 more. It was not just the extremes of callousness that unsettled me, but the complete lack of any sense that the poor or the weak might have the slightest intrinsic value. Why did I find this disturbing? Because in my morals and ethics, I was not a Spartan or a Roman at all. Now, assumptions I had grown up with about how a society should properly be organized and the principles it should uphold were not bred of classical antiquity, still less of human nature, but very distinctively of that civilization's Christian past. And he's right. When we look at ancient cultures, we can see this, that they valued the city and the culture of the city and the community over the individuals who populated it. For example, remember the movie The 300. We get a good glimpse of Sparta here, and it shows some pretty telling examples that are actually true. Men marching off to war, for example, while being told, either come back with your shield or upon it. In other words, either come back victorious or die trying. Now, distinguished professor of sociology Rodney Stark writes this in his book, The Victory of Reason. He says, quote, "From its earliest days, Christianity was equally inventive in its conceptions of human nature and in confronting the issues of morality. Chief among these were propositions concerning fundamental human rights such as liberty and freedom. And underlying these ideas was something even more basic, the discovery of individualism, of the self. Even Greek philosophers had no concept quite equivalent to our notion of the person. Thus, when Plato was writing the Republic, his focus was on the polis, on the city, not on its citizens. Indeed, he even denounced private property. Yes, it was the good of Rome or the good of Athens or the good of Sparta that motivated the people, not the good of you or me. You can be expendable. In fact, Oxford scholar Larry Siedentop agrees. In his book, Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism, he points specifically to the writings of St. Paul as the foundation of the concept of the individual, as holding intrinsic worth. It would be something that Augustine would later magnify and popularize across Western Europe, but it comes from Christian teaching in Christian scripture. Rodney Stark observes, quote, "Of the major world faiths, only Christianity has devoted serious and sustained attention to human rights, as opposed to human duties. I think that's important because many faiths talk about what your duty is, but not any faith that we can see anchors it in the fact that you are part of the image of God. You bear the imago Dei. And we have immediate consequences from this from the very beginnings of Christianity. For example, something that was rampant in the time of Jesus and right afterwards was infanticide, disposing of unwanted infants. It was common in the ancient world. Greece and Rome thought that those who were weak or injured were of little use to the greater community, and they should be abolished. Frederick Farrar, scholar, says infanticide was famously universal across these cultures. In fact, we even have a first-century letter from a nobleman in Rome who's writing to his pregnant wife. He's trying to conduct some business, and he's telling her how to go about doing these things as he's away. And he writes, quote, "Know that I am still in Alexandria. I ask and beg you to take good care of our baby son. And as soon as I receive payment, I shall send it up to you." So they already have one child who's a boy. He continues to say, "If you are delivered," in other words, if you have another baby, the other baby, she's still pregnant, "if you are delivered before I come home, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it." And that's what they would do. They would take these children, they would just throw them on the banks of the Tiber River, allowing them to starve, allowing them to be exposed to the elements, allowing them to be ravaged by wild animals, whatever the case may be. And it was the Christians who would find these children and scoop them up. But it wasn't just the Greeks and the Romans. The Phoenicians and the Carthaginians were famous in their offering of children as part of their sacrifices. Plutarch writes of the Carthaginians, he says, quote, "They offered up their own children, and those with no children would buy little ones from poor people and cut their throats as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without a tear or moan." This kind of idea was also found in Mesoamerica, in the Incan Empire. Of course, we read about it in the Old Testament. The Canaanite tribes would do this. They would have their god Molech, bronze god with outstretched arms, who they would light a fire inside this shell of the statue, heating it up to thousands of degrees, and then laying infants on his outstretched arms to be burned alive. And it's hideous, but again, we see it across all cultures. Africa, Australia, North American and Inuit tribes practice this. Ancient Scotland, we show records of it. Even today, in rural parts of India and rural parts of China, do we see this, where people are more concerned about having a boy than having a girl, and they don't want the added expense of a child, especially if they're poorer. And this is a big issue. But more commonly across cultures, unwanted children were simply abandoned to die by exposure to the elements. Spartan children, like I said, that movie, The 300, they were deemed fit or unfit by a city council. So you don't even get to make that choice yourself. Female children, of course, you had to pay a dowry. They were not as desirable as males. And anytime you have cults, temple cults, sex cults, where you would have a lot of men coming in order to have sexual relations as part of their worship service, or you had Roman citizens who would visit the prostitutes. Anytime you have a sexual promiscuity problem, it would naturally lead to a problem of unwanted children, because that's the normal, natural outcome of sexual intercourse. And what do you do with those unwanted children? You have to have some way to deal with them. Well, they did it through infanticide. We do it by taking them into Planned Parenthood clinics. But you see, the Christian view of children, souls created in God's image and redeemed by Christ, is far different. And this starts immediately with Jesus. Matthew 19:14. Jesus teaches his disciples, "Let the children alone. Do not hinder them from coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." That's value. He's saying these are not people that you throw away. These are some that my Father loves. They are of the kingdom of heaven. Even the unborn, in Psalm 139, the psalmist tells us that when God looks at him, "Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all the days written of me that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them." In other words, even in utero, I was valuable, and you knew. Now, soon after Christianity was launched, we're talking first century, AD 85 to 110, a book was put together that had the teachings of the apostles, kind of a guidebook on how some of the basic Christian values should be understood, the Didache. And it was commended not to commit infanticide in that book. So right away, Christians were teaching this is not what we do. In a more formal fashion, as they saw the broader culture, the world at large, start to do this, a student of Polycarp, now remember, the Apostle John taught Polycarp, right? So Polycarp was a student of the Apostle John, and then his student, being this of Dijon, provided protection and nourishment for abandoned children right at the late AD 100s, the late 2nd century. In fact, he was even martyred for his efforts. Now, saving physically frail and unwanted children, that struck the Romans not merely as queer, but as almost wrong. It was an affront. Seneca even writes, "We drown children who are at birth weakly and abnormal. What are you doing? You're polluting our society with these unwanted ones, with these miscasts." Well, this continued on, and what happened was there was a formal effort to rescue children abandoned to the elements by the late 200s. Saint Afra of Augsburg is a famous saint who started this issue. She, in fact, was a prostitute. Now, she must have seen and probably contributed herself to child abandonment, but she was then converted to Christianity. And what she did was she developed a ministry to take in unwanted children, the children of prisoners, thieves, smugglers and pirates, runaway slaves and brigands. Now think about this. This is amazing because this is the lowest dregs of society. And if you don't value people in general, these people are disposable, let alone their children. Beyond that, what Christians are doing is they're doing something that is of great personal cost to themselves. Again, in this day and age, you don't have the guarantee of 1 meal a day, let alone 3. Everything that you have has to be worked on. You don't have a lot of calories, so you get tired easily. There's not enough food to go around, and you're bringing new mouths to feed because you found them on the side of a river. Babies require a lot of attention, too. You're taking away time from raising the crops in order to care for these infants, some of whom have handicaps, and that's the reason why they were abandoned. This is what Christianity did. Carl Schmidt, in his book, says, quote, "Clement of Alexandria condemned the Romans for saving young birds and other creatures, while lacking the moral compunctions about abandoning their own children." And I think he's right. This is the change. You had to dress down the Romans in order to let them understand that this was something that was irrehensible, right? There's no excuse for it. After Constantine became Christianized, took over Rome, and declared Christianity a proper faith that can be followed, within 50 years, Bishop Basil of Caesarea convinced the Roman Emperor to outlaw infanticide within the empire, just within 50 years. And as Europe grew, as it became more Christian, more laws were enacted to make child abandonment illegal. Tantamount to murder is what they called it. Now, granted, you have areas, Brittany, you have areas that are German Gaul and Germania, places that Rome didn't reach as well, and people didn't necessarily like to subscribe to those things. So they bucked it. And child sacrifice and child abandonment, infanticide did continue through those years, even though it was officially illegal. But the moral understanding of infants being fully human persons of equal worth, that happens through the Christian worldview. That becomes established through the Christian worldview. Again, even today, infanticide is practiced in certain rural areas in the East. And it happens even though we would be aghast at that. Yet, the reason why we hold that view is because Christianity taught it to us. Now, it's not just infants where we see human value raised. Let's talk about the charge that religion oppresses women and subjugates people. No, actually, Christianity elevated the status of women. If we look at the status of women in the 1st century, prior to Jesus, or during Jesus' life, we see several things. First of all, in ancient Greece, Athenian philosophers believed that women had strong emotions and weak minds. That's what they write. And for this reason, they have to be protected from themselves, and they have to be protected from doing damage to others. So you got to be careful. Those women can't, for example, interact in politics at all. Now, if you were talking to the Athenians, they would divide women into kind of two groups. Ancient Greece had women, understood women to have one of two roles. The first role was wives and potential wives. These are individuals who will bring me a son, who will carry on my lineage, who will help me provide posterity. These were the elite women of the society. All the other women, they fall into that second group. They're good for entertainment value, for recreation, to have sex with, what have you, or slaves to do the household chores, things like that. But it was almost impossible to move from that second group to the first. And the law in ancient Greece allowed a man to kill on the spot anyone else who was having sex with his wife, mother, daughter, sister, or concubine, any of his women. They were basically almost chattel at that point in Greece. In ancient Rome, it was a little different. The technology, the perception of family played a greater role in ancient Rome, and there was a higher regard in Roman cultures for the role of the wife. But the wives were still the wives' primary responsibility was to rear children. They weren't the breeding machines of Greece. But adultery in Rome, as elsewhere at this time, was defined as sexual activity between a married woman and a man not her husband. Why is that important? Because men, the husbands themselves, wouldn't be considered adulterous if they were going to the temple prostitute, if they were raping their slave, if they were doing anything in that regard where sex was available to them. You see, a woman couldn't do that. If she was married to a man, she had to be faithful to that man and no one else. Women were still deemed inferior. Roman culture placed her under the law of patria potestas and manus. That gave man total control over his daughters, total control over his wife. They had restrictions placed against them on attending public spectacles. Women weren't necessarily allowed to come and go as freely as men in those regards. They had to get permission from their husband. A father could kill his daughter if he found her in the act and her lover in the act of sex. In his own home, a husband could kill his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act of adultery. Wife could never kill the husband if she found the same. And a husband, they did give a divorce decree. If he just wanted to divorce her, he had 60 days to do so if it's proven that she had committed adultery. But a wife couldn't divorce the husband. So again, you had some advancement, but it was much more limited, very limited. What about even the Jewish view of women? Let's talk about Judaism and how things happened in Judea in the first century, because here's another culture that actually has biblical roots, right? Well, by this time, Jewish teaching held that women were basically the servants of men. They were looked down upon in Hebrew culture. In fact, during the oral law era, say 400 BC to AD 200, the Hebrew wife was obligated to washing her husband's face, hands, and feet, according to the Kebuthoth. The Hebrew prayer that many men would say is, "Blessed art thou, Lord God of the universe, who did not make me a woman in the Mahat." So he said, you didn't make me a Gentile, you didn't make me a dog, you didn't make me a woman. I'm so blessed. The Talmud even has an entire book titled the Nida, which largely deals with women's menstrual uncleanness and how they have to deal with that. It was a big deal. And women were not to take part in significant religious observances. We have Josephus telling us, let the words of the law, that is the Torah, be burned rather than committed to a woman. Now that's a big statement, that if it came out of a woman's mouth, it would be so heinous that you would rather burn the scroll. And if you understand how the Jewish hierarchy of that day felt about the Torah, that's a big deal. A rabbi would even teach that it is shameful to hear a woman's voice in public among men. So you see this problem. Women were separated from men. They were separated in the synagogue in a partitioned area all their own. Their testimony wasn't even allowed in a court of law. Then comes Christianity. What happens there? Well, Christianity recognizes, first of all, that women were created with equal worth. Of course, in Genesis, we read the account that Adam is incomplete, right? It's not good for man to be alone. Let us make him a helpmate. And God later says the two shall become one flesh. Now, how that gets twisted down the line in Judaism, I'm not quite sure, but I do know that Christianity provides a proper corrective. For Christianity elevates women both in the story of Jesus and in the teachings of the church afterwards. For example, the only followers of Jesus to stand with him in his crucifixion were women. Now, if you're making up these crucifixion accounts, if you're inventing a story so that you can create a religion where people will follow you, you don't have all the men running and hiding in corners and not heard from while the women are standing there with their Lord facing his ultimate execution. That's not how you would make this read. It's backwards. There were women in the upper room who were anointed with the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, just like the men. Jesus was born to an earthly mother, but not an earthly father. So we have a human female that is responsible for Jesus' existence. Only a woman understood Jesus' upcoming death in Mark 14:8, when she breaks the flask of perfume and pours it over his feet. And he says, she's doing this to prepare me for my funeral. And of course, it's a woman who sees Jesus first in his resurrected state, Mary Magdalene, in John chapter 20. Now, again, we also have teachings, as I said. New Testament passages show that equal worth of women are paramount. Galatians 3:28 is the most famous, where Paul writes, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. This is the great leveling verse. This is the big deal. This statement is so far removed from all these aspects of the ancient world. It's staggering. We take it for granted, but this is radical for the day. When Jesus was born, he was presented to Simeon the prophet, but he was also presented to the prophetess Anna. Notice that equality. Notice the parity that we see in both those cases. Women were welcomed in Christian worship. Mary sat at Jesus' feet, just as Paul sat at Gamaliel's. The first person, as I said, to see Jesus resurrected was a woman. We have people meeting in a woman's home. The church is meeting in a woman's home in 2 John. The first European convert was a woman in Acts 16:4. And over again, we see that women are just as involved in worship as men. There is none of these segregate them, put them aside. And again, these are Jewish people growing up in this Jewish culture. This is radically different, even for the Jews of that day. And we talked about adultery a little bit in the different civilizations. Jesus actually redefines adultery in a very radical way. In Matthew 5:28, he says, quote, whoever looks at a woman with lust in his heart has committed adultery already. Now let's think about that statement. Is he talking about women committing adultery? No, if you're looking at a woman with lust in your heart, you're a man. It's masculine, those masculine pronouns. He's saying men can commit adultery, and it doesn't even have to be the actual act. It can simply be your thought process. What happens with all of this? What does this mean? Well, women became more prominent in society. In fact, again, after Constantine sanctions Christianity as one of the official religious faiths, in 374 AD, Emperor Valentinian outlawed the law of patria potestas. So 50 to 70 years later, the law has been changed. Women could not be sold to a husband. Women were not under the husband's absolute rule. Thus, women began marrying later, and even the concept of the veil began to give way as women were viewed more equally and not had to be covered or silenced. Now, the veil didn't go away completely until after the first millennium. A lot of that was cultural. But you see what happens. Polygamy becomes outdated as Christian teachings on being the husband of just one wife prevails. And infidelity, as we heard, was defined as both sexes held are equally responsible. Widows were not burned or buried. They were honored. And James tells us that we need to take care of women. And so in all of this, women were much more elevated in the Christian tradition, which continues today. This is the reason why we can talk about women being equal to men, neither slave nor free, male nor female. You're all the same equality. It's not just children, it's not just women, it's even those dregs of society, the weak, the injured, the criminal. And the best way we can see how Christianity made the biggest impact in this area is to look at the gladiatorial games. Now, most people have seen the Gladiator movie with Russell Crowe. I thought it was pretty good, it does show some of the kind of depraved entertainment that Romans would look for. If you understand the history behind it, the first recorded gladiatorial combats took place in Rome in 264 BCE. Decimus Junius Brutus Abignus staged gladiatorial games in honor of his dead father, Brutus Pera. And he had just conquered one of the areas. And what happened was he had 22 prisoners of war, and he decided to pick 3 pairs of slaves, 3 pairs of those prisoners of war, to have them fight each other. And it was to honor his father and to have a day of entertainment. Now, most gladiators were criminals or prisoners of war, although as it progressed in later centuries, what happened was you could start getting fame and fortune. People would bet on you. You would have handlers. You can actually make some money if you were really good at this. And because that happened, you started seeing more people volunteer. But one of the reasons they would volunteer is because it was pretty much the only way you could get out of slavery. You could actually make enough money to buy yourself out of your own slavery. So it was the way to escape. But it was, as it grew, it became more and more bloody and more widespread. Sometimes 100 or more gladiators would fight in a single day in the Colosseum. Sometimes they faced wild animals. And of course, as famously portrayed in films, the crowd would ultimately determine, or they could ultimately determine, the fate of the gladiator by signaling whether they should live or die. And you better do what the crowd says. Matter of fact, Carlin A. Barton says, quote, "The inability or unwillingness of gladiators to go eagerly to his own slaughter filled the audience with disgust and wrath and deprived the gladiator of his glory." What? You're not willing to die for my entertainment? What's the matter with you? You're a gladiator. That's what you should be. But there's a change. And what happens is Christianity comes in, and they recognize that these are individuals also who bear the image of God. Tertullian, who writes about AD 220, he writes an entire chapter on how Christians should abstain from the Roman games. He says, this is heinous. This is something that we shouldn't be involved with. It's blood sport. What is the matter with you? The Romans, hearing this, criticized the Christians for their reaction. And they write, "You do not go to our shows. You take no part in our possessions. You shrink in horror from our games." Basically, they're saying, what's the matter with you? Why are you people so antisocial? You don't do all the things that we do. This is how our society works. This is the fun that we have. Why do you have to be the stick in the mud? Well, you Christians, you just don't. Does this sound familiar at all to you? Gosh, you don't like our entertainment? Oh, you don't like pornography? Don't have one. Oh, you don't like gladiatorial games? Don't go to them. Well, people are still getting hurt. People are still dying. But the Romans criticized for that. Again, after Constantine, actually, the games continued. And this is actually surprising. They became so ingrained in the culture that the evil of the gladiatorial games happened well into AD 400. Now, the story is that about 403 AD, there was a gladiatorial bout happening in the arena, and a Christian bishop from the east named Telemachus was traveling, and he came into the arena, saw the games, and was so sickened by it, so offended, that he actually jumps into the ring with the crowd and saying, "In the name of God, stop. These people are made in the image of God." Remember, this is some 75, 80 years after Christianity has been dominant in the Roman Empire. But the crowd, of course, having their fun interrupted, did not take kindly to that message. And what they asked? They said, "Kill him, kill Telemachus." And he died for his protest. However, Christians heard that a bishop was slain because of people's desire to see blood sport. And the ensuing outcry took, within a year, it reached the ear of Emperor Honorius, and he completely banned gladiatorial games in 404 AD, which is amazing. The result is, as W.E.H. Leakey says, quote, "There is scarcely any single reform so important in the moral history of mankind as the suppression of the gladiatorial shows, a feat that must almost exclusively be ascribed to the Christian church." So we cared for the lowest of the low. And you care for them not merely by telling people to spare their lives, but you try to spare their lives yourselves. For example, hospitals are really primarily a Christian invention. Now, let me go through this because there can be a little bit of confusion here. First, we have to recognize that Jesus cared for the physical as well as the spiritual health of an individual, right? He healed the sick as well as forgiving their sins. Prior to Christianity, most places for the sick weren't hospitals per se. They were more temples. You would drag your ill relative into the temple so that he could pray to the gods to heal him. And that would be pretty much all you could do. Galen and some of the other writers may have you, let some blood or have someone visit your home to attend to you if you're wealthy, but there's no widespread place for healing all individuals. Some Roman and Greek governments almost also created valetudinari, which were Roman soldier kind of clinics, because you have these trained Roman soldiers. You don't want them to die. They're too valuable to you for the army. So you would have the soldiers in these situations where they could be healed. But you don't have the general populace necessarily going to these institutions. There may have been some pre-Christian dedicated establishments for the sick in, say, ancient India and Sri Lanka. We're not sure. But according to Schmidt, we don't have a lot of documentation of it. And if these were built, they definitely didn't continue. Because when British came in and occupied India in the 18th century, hospitals for the poor and sick, they said, didn't even exist. There may have been rumors of them. We don't see them. So how come Christianity changes things? Well, you read the Bible. 1 Peter 4:9, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Now, that word hospitality today, we use it to mean like, bring a person in and treat them to a nice meal if they're, your guest. It's kind of guest response. But hospital comes from the word hospitality, and it means to take care of those who are in need. And Christian teachings of hospitality in that context are all over the place. 1 Timothy 3:2, Titus 1:8, other places like that. Of course, the most famous we know is the parable of Jesus and the Good Samaritan. This is a very famous story where Jesus makes a point of saying it wasn't even the people who should have taken care of the guy, right? The priest and the Levite walk along with this guy who got beat up and tossed on the side of the road. It is his mortal enemy, the Samaritan, who comes, bandages him up, puts him on his donkey, takes him to the inn. Notice, no hospital, but he takes them to the inn. And he pays the innkeeper out of his own pocket and says, hey, if there's any other charges while you're taking care of them, let me know. I'll pay those too. This is Jesus' teaching, and we as Christians want to follow Jesus' teachings. Therefore, almost immediately after Christianity was considered official, Constantine issued an edict in the Council of Nicaea for a xenodoctrina. That's an edict to receive strangers in any town where a cathedral exists. So now you have a place backed by the purse of the emperor. And we're going to build these cathedrals. If there's a cathedral, we're going to make sure that in the cathedral there is a formal institution where you can care for the sick. And as a result, we have the first instance of government institutions that were specifically designed to care for the sick and the poor. St. Basil's was built in AD 369, as an example. These, in fact, are the first charitable institutions really in existence, the ones whose only sole purpose is to take care of someone else at no cost to yourself. And that carries on. Most hospitals, even in the U.S. today, were started by local congregations and denominations, be it St. Jude or the Catholic schools or the Loma Linda over here by me is Seventh-day Adventist. You can trace most hospitals to a movement of Christendom. Other organizations, such as the Red Cross and other international relief efforts, also began because they were Christian-motivated outreaches. So we see it across the weak, the maimed, the hurt. Now, you may be thinking, well, what about the other thing, though? What about slavery? How do we deal with Christianity and slavery? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that slavery has always been a universal attribute within humanity. There is no culture where slavery in some way, shape, or form did not exist. Matter of fact, it went on 3 times longer in the Islamic world than it did in the European world. Chinese practiced it. The Mesoamericans, the Incas, and the Aztecs practiced it. The different Native American tribes practice it. Wherever you find one group of people conquering another, you will find slavery. There is just no getting around it. But there is only one culture that purposely and intentionally abolished slavery, and that was Christianity. We look at William Wilberforce, for example, whose 20-year effort seeking to outlaw the slave trade in England, where he would argue in Parliament day after day. It became his life's work. It became his motivation. And he finally accomplished it, where England was the very first nation to abolish slavery intentionally. The American abolitionist movement, as well, prior to the Civil War, it was fueled by preachers like Charles Finney, Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy was a preacher who was an abolitionist. He also had a newspaper that he continued to use to lobby for the cause, and it ultimately cost him his life for the effort. They killed him because of it. The Reverend John Ranker, another preacher, his Rankin Station on the Underground Railroad helped shepherd over 2,000 escaped slaves to safety, making his house, which was just across from the slave state of Kentucky, one of the most significant landmarks in the fight against the slavery trade. Edward Beecher, a pastor and the first president of the Illinois College, organized an anti-slavery society in Illinois. Over and over again, you see the abolitionist movement was led by Christians. It was Christians who tried to abolish slavery. Now, you may say, well, what about the Christians who were pro-slavery in the South? They were wrong. I mean, yes, there were Christians in the South, but they were simply wrong. They simply were incompatible with the teachings of Scriptures. We read Galatians 3:28, that there is no slave nor free. If you read other New Testament texts, you can see that we all have equality in the eyes of God. And if you look at even teachings like Augustine's and others, which these Christians didn't mention, it was clear that it wasn't part of the biblical framework to enslave another human being. Christianity was a force for good against slavery. Christianity elevated human value. What about human society, though? What about ethics? Well, it turns out Christianity does create a more civilized society. Now, we heard the claim at the beginning that religion is the cause of most of the wars in history, right? In fact, you read things like in Belfast, Christopher Hitchens says this, in Belfast, I have seen whole streets burned out by sectarian warfare between different sects of Christianity, and interviewed people whose relatives and friends have been kidnapped and killed or tortured by rival religious death squads. Now, if Hitchens thinks that the Northern Irish and English War is primarily about religion, I think he's kidding himself. It's much more about the political structure in those areas. Again, Sam Harris, religion is the most prolific source of violence in our history. Well, let's take a look at what the historians say. There is a great book out called The Encyclopedia of Wars by Charles Phillip and Alan Axelrod. And what they seek to do is these authors seek to catalog all of the different wars that we know throughout history. They list 1,763 wars with 3 full volumes of data. They're huge. It covers most of the wars that have been somehow documented in any way, shape, or form. Of those 1,763, 123 were religious in nature, and you can see this on the graph. So again, most wars are fought for power, for control. Even though they may wrap their rhetoric in religious garb, it's not religion that's the primary motivator. It's Genghis Khan wanting to take control, or it's Alexander the Great wanting to conquer, or it's Julius Caesar marching his. It's not. None of those are religion, right? They have nothing to do with that. But there are some. Again, 6.98%, 123 out of 1763 were religious in nature. But of that 6.9%, about half, 66 of them, Islam was the motivator. Islam was the primer. It was Muhammad's followers who were conquering by the sword, and the Christians or whomever had to react. So if you take out Islam, it's only 3.23% of wars that we know of are actually considered religion as the primary cause of war. That seems far different from the claim that Harris and Hitchens and others are making. Most wars, as I said, are fought simply for political purposes or sheerly greed. Keith Ward, in his book, Is Religion Dangerous?, makes this point. He says, quote, human history as a whole is a history of warfare and violence. This is just what people do. Religion may have played some part in these affairs, but it is in the desire for power and wealth that's the constant factor. One of the things, though, that Christianity does do, recognizing that war is a consistent aspect of who we are as individuals, they come up with a way that's, wait a minute, there needs to be constraints on war. I don't think you can abolish all wars. That'll never happen. But we need to know when it is appropriate to respond in aggression and when it is not. And there's an idea called just war theory that comes out of the Christian tradition. A just war, for example, can only be waged as a last resort. All nonviolent options must be exhausted before the use of force can be justified. A war is just only if it is waged by a legitimate authority. Even just causes themselves cannot be served by actions taken by individuals or groups who are not authoritative. So you can't have a mob. You can't use mob violence and call it a just war, even if somebody actually affronted you. You have to have someone who constitutes an authority sanctioned by whatever society to which they belong, and outsiders to the society would also recognize as legitimate a government entity, as an example. A just war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. For example, self-defense against an armed attack is always considered justified, right? Although the justice of the cause may not be considered sufficient, right? It's not just because you were offended. There's more to it. A just war can be fought with right intentions. And this is a big important part, that the only permissible objective of the war is to redress the injury. You can't extract vengeance beyond what's necessary. And a war can only be just if it's fought with reasonable chance of success. If you're telling your country we're going to go against them and you know that all of your guys are going to be wiped out, then you probably shouldn't do it. Death and injury incurred in a hopeless cause are not morally justifiable. You have to let people decide for themselves. You can't conscript them to war if you know that they're all going to get wiped out. It's up to them to deal with what they need to know. The ultimate goal of a just war, that's just simply to reestablish peace. More specifically, the peace established after the war must be preferable to the peace that would have been prevailed if the war had not been fought. So we look at it before and we look at it after, and we say, okay, Hitler is a problem. He's not going to calm down. It's going to be worse if we just acquiesce to him. We need to take him out. And violence used in the war must be proportional to the injury suffered. You can't just drop nukes on say, a low-level entity. We shouldn't nuke Cuba, for example. That would be completely inappropriate. And the weapons used in war must discriminate as much as they can between combatants and non-combatants. Civilians, we recognize they will be hurt in war. There's no way around that, but they're never permissible targets of war. We should try to avoid killing civilians as much as we can. If they're unavoidable victims, if there's a deliberate attack that's going to, for example, kill all of us, and you're shooting rockets from behind a hospital, well, we have no choice. We would love to avoid killing civilians, but that's unavoidable because it's either you or us, and that's all we can do. But again, you have to scale it so that you can do the least amount of damage to the civilians as possible. Ultimately, though, when this charge is given, my reaction is there seems to be more deaths caused by atheism than there ever has been through Christian wars. The greatest massacres ever imputed by one government or one sovereign against another is through atheistic moves. So for example, the 26.3 million Chinese during the regime of Mao Zedong between the years of 1949 and May 1965. The Walker Report places that total death toll between 32 and 61 million people. We don't know how many they actually killed, but it was staggering. In the Bolshevik Revolution and throughout the USSR's early history, from October 1917 to December 1959, Lenin and Stalin plus Khrushchev killed at least 66 million people. Now, as a percentage of the nation's total population, the worst genocide that we know of appears to be that in Cambodia. More than 1/3 of the 8 million Khmer were killed between April 17, 1975 and January 1979 under Pol Pot, who was the Communist Party ruler there. So over and over again, we see that it is atheistic communist regimes who eschew religion. Remember, I read the Marx quotes to you. And it goes over and over again. Figures the Mongolian invasion from northern China from 1210 to 1219 and from 1311 to 1340, they estimate maybe 35 million people. When we see the death over and over in ancient China, in modern communist regimes, what we find out is that it is not religion that's causing most deaths. It is, again, the seeking of power, and most of the deaths that we see are seeking power through an atheistic, communistic point of view. Now, one of the other things that changed in ethics was the concept of Christian charity blossomed. So giving used to be very quid pro quo. It was giving to get. and you would do something for someone else so that they would do something for you. This is even how the ancient Greeks and Romans would worship their gods. Maybe if I give them a sacrifice, they'll be nice to me. It was a this for that. Romans primarily practiced liberalitas, that's giving to please the recipient or to make themselves look honored, right? So hey, maybe if I give this nice guy, then he'll take me under his wing. He'll give me a slot in the Senate. He'll do what have you. But Christian charity said, no, that's not quite what it's supposed to be. In fact, Christian teaching was that you would give voluntarily, you would give generously, and you'd give in secret. Poverty was seen as a way to get slave labor in the old world, not a situation where you should help another. And again, Plato in his Republic praised the physician Asclepius for not treating those, quote, preoccupied with their illnesses. If you're over worried about that, don't worry about them. Just take care of the people who can do something good for you. Plautus, who was a Roman philosopher, wrote, quote, "You do a beggar a bad service by giving him food and drink. You lose what you give, and you prolong his life for more misery." So here's the ancient thought process about charity. But Christians were noted for their charity. They were noted for their soft-heartedness to those in need. In fact, during the 300s, in one aspect of Rome, there was an emperor named Julian the Apostate. This is one of the guys who came up right in the middle of the early Christian Roman emperors, and he wanted to flip Rome back to its old glory days, and he wanted to do that by invoking the old gods again. And Julian the Apostate was quoted as saying, quote, "The impious Galileans," meaning Christians, "the impious Galileans receive both their own poor and ours. It is shameful that ours should be so destitute of our assistance." In other words, how come we aren't taking care of our own? Because there's no motivation in our faith system. But the Christians, not only did they take care of their own, they even take care of us. Pachomius writes, he was swept up against his will in a Roman army recruitment drive at the age of 20. And that was a common occurrence in those days. There was civil wars in the period, and so he was swept up and held in captivity. But it was here that local Christians would daily bring food and comfort to the inmates, which made a lasting impression on him. And he vowed to investigate Christianity further. When he got out, as fate would have it, he was able to get out of the army without ever having to fight. And then he got converted and was baptized. So here's one way that Christianity was demonstrably charitable. And because of that, he reacted. And of course, it wasn't just being charity in helping people. Orphanages were developed in the Christian world. In the ancient world, you had much shorter lifespans. So kids would be orphaned very easily. Women could die in childbirth. After having a couple, they could die in the third one. Anyway, from classical Greece through the Middle Ages, the average life expectancy of people was maybe 30 years old. And of course, the problems of sanitation and other conditions, orphans would be a significant issue across the different empire. Now, James 1:27 tells us this: "Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." Now, right after Constantine comes into power, orphanotrophies began. In other words, these orphan facilities developed. Godparents were instituted at baptisms to ensure that they would care for children in case the parents died. And this whole society, this whole continuation even shows up today. William Booth and the Salvation Army, for example, you see this Christian charity and the down and outers. Rescue missions that we have reaching the homeless. 90% of the rescue missions you find are Christian institutions. The U.S. is still the number one altruistic nation in the entire world. And that becomes important. And when we see all that is developed in these, we see, again, the idea of charity becomes radically flipped on its head. It's not give to get, it's charity as we understand it. And if you believe charity is important, you're holding a Christian worldview. Now, what about progress, though? Did Christianity create that hole, that 1,000-year gap? Would we be more advanced today if it wasn't for the so-called Dark Ages? Well, no. History shows one thing, that Christianity advanced human knowledge. First, we can look at education. Christian catechisms taught both men and women the same thing in the same setting. Now, that was unique, right? And we were considered people of the book. Because scriptures were written down, one of the things that we would do is we would teach men and women to read, because it was important for them to read the scripture. So we became a literate people. Rodney Stark makes this point as well, where he talks about how as Christianity spread, the availability of literacy starts to rise. In fact, Martin Luther, in his day, petitioned the civic authorities to open government-funded public educational establishments so that the masses could become literate. And it was a big push. And when Christianity continued to expand in different areas, we see that as well. Robert Woodberry, who did an amazing study of colonization in the African continent, there was a lot of good documentation then because many areas of Africa were colonized in the mid-1800s, where we had a lot of letters, we had a lot of documentation that we can trace these efforts. But there were also areas that were colonized by Roman Catholics, and there were areas that were colonized by those of Muslim origin. And what Woodberry found was something that was fascinating in his study, and he examined this every single way that he could. No one's been able to find holes in his research. But he writes, quote, areas where Protestant missionaries had significant presence in the past are on average today more economically developed, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental associations. So what Woodberry is saying, here's what you have. We ran an experiment. We had 4 different groups. We have a control group, those areas that were never colonized. We have an Islamic group, those areas that were dominated by Islamic culture. We have a Catholic group, and we have a Protestant group. And he says, if you want a blossoming democracy in 21st century world in Africa, the solution is simple. You have to send a time machine to the 19th century and send a Protestant missionary to those African nations. And it's the Protestant missionaries. In every case, those African nations have a better success rate than their peers who are actually being proselytized at the same time. Abbé Charles Michel de created sign language, for example, so that the deaf could hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. So here's how the deaf became literate. Did Christianity stifle knowledge, or did they expand knowledge to the deaf? Modern universities, the bastions of knowledge that we see in the West, those grew out of monasteries. And the major universities of the West, the Sorbonne, Oxford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, all of these were first and foremost seminaries in their inception. It is the Christian tradition to pass on education. And this is what we see over and over again. Now, some may say, but what about science? You know, religion smothers science. For example, organized religion has stifled science for more than 1,000 years. Most of us are familiar with the story of Galileo, who discovered the earth was not the center of the universe, nor even our sun, but that we were merely one speck among accountable billions. The church put a stop to him with the threat of torture and death. The same was true of medicine. The study of human anatomy was forbidden. Now, there's a lot in this quote that's assumed, and you really have to unpack the history behind all this. First of all, Galileo was a Christian his whole life. He wasn't persecuted because he said the simply because he said that the planets revolve around the sun and not around the earth. The Catholic hierarchy of his day were very, very much Aristotelian, and Aristotle held to a different model, and they didn't like the fact that he was bucking Aristotle. Copernicus was around well before Galileo, and he wasn't declared a heretic. His theory did not cause shock and horror. But Galileo was also a bristly individual. I mean, at the day, he wrote a book where he calls the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, basically, Simplicus, a simpleton, if you will. And he would throw insults around. So when they would push on him, he would push back. It was much more a political thing. And he was just placed under house arrest. But it wasn't that his books were all burned or things like that. Really, as I said, he was confronting Aristotelianism, and the philosophers of his day really had a problem. You call the Pope a fool. You tell the heads of the colleges that they don't know what they're talking about, and they'll buck against that. But when you look at science as a project, what we find is science is actually a product of the Christian worldview. Otto J. Hellwig notes this, and Cambridge historian Herbert Butterfield, in his book, The Origins of Modern Science, puts out a whole argument that convincingly shows what happened in the 16th century and following, in other words, in the Renaissance, was not so much a result of new data, but of changed minds. Now, other cultures had given great discoveries to the human race, the introduction of zero from the Hindus, the algebra from Muslims, etc., etc. But the Christian West had a certain unique set of assumptions that allow science to flourish. The three main assumptions are, according to this view, the universe is orderly, that's number one. The orderly universe can be known. And number three, there is a motive to discover that order. There's something that we should do. Now, the Greek and Roman cultures, they didn't have any of this. They had none of these assumptions. The gods were fickle, right? They were unpredictable. You couldn't know from day to day what they would do. In fact, if we look back at Rodney Stark in The Victory of Reason, he quotes Oxford historian Joseph Needham, famous historian of science. And he says, even if we look at the Chinese who had invented gunpowder, etc., he says, quote, the failure of the Chinese to develop science was due to their religion, to the inability of the Chinese intellectuals to believe the existence of the laws of nature, because the conception of a divine celestial lawgiver imposing ordinances on non-human nature never developed. In other words, only a Christian worldview seems to fit this criteria. In fact, Alfred North Whitehead writes, quote, in the first place, there can be no living science unless there is a widespread instinctive conviction in the existence of an order of things, and, in particular, of an order of nature. The inexpugnable belief that every detailed occurrence can be correlated with its antecedents in a perfectly definite manner, that must come from a medieval mind insistence on the rationality of God. One example I can give you of this is Matthew Maury, the father of modern oceanography. I love this example. He's a Christian who loved reading his Bible. He also had doubts about its accuracy, and these facts sometimes led to remarkable discoveries. Maury entered the Navy in 1825, but he was partially disabled during an accident, so he left active sea duty in 1839. Now, 3 years later, he's still with the Navy. He's still appointed superintendent of Naval Observatory in Washington. He could do the observatory, couldn't be on ships. And also of the U.S. Depot of Charts and Instruments. But over the next 19 years, he devotes himself to studying the winds, clouds, weather, and the ocean features, as well as the Bible. In his Bible studies, when he was healing from his injury, the words of Psalm 8 stuck in his mind. Whatever passes through the paths of the sea. And when Murray heard that, he was shocked. He stood up and he said, if God's word said there were paths in the sea, then there must be paths in the sea. So he set out to find them. And certainly enough, there were. He was the man who discovered ocean currents. And that's what we find. Lastly and quickly, I just want to note that it is Christianity that gives true meaning to life. Human flourishing flowers because of Christianity. If you look at Christianity's record for good, let me give you three names. Mother Teresa, from 1931 to 1948, Mother Teresa taught at St. Mary's High School in Calcutta. But suffering the poverty she glimpsed outside the convent walls, and that made such a deep impression on her that in 1948 she received permission from her superiors to leave the convent school and devote herself to working among the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta. Although she had no funds, she depended on divine providence and started an open-air school for slum children. Soon she was joined by voluntary helpers, and financial support was also forthcoming. Here we see Christianity in full force. Again, William Wilberforce, struggling in England to abolish the slave trade. We talked about him at length. And William Booth in the Salvation Army, reaching out to the low and destitute across all nations. We can also look at George Mueller, who lived in the 19th century. He was born in Prussia. He was an evangelist, establishing orphanages in Bristol, England, after there was a cholera epidemic that wiped out quite a few people. Over the next 60 years, he cared for more than 10,000 orphaned and abandoned children. So Christianity changes people to make others' lives better. Christianity answers the question, why are we here? Because we have a purpose, because we have a telos, because God designed us to seek him out and help one another and enjoy his creation. All of these things are part and parcel of the Christian project, right? A new command I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this, all you men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Or James 1, a pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Again, all men are created by God equally. We see this over and over again. So, looking at the internet atheists, it's easy to criticize Christianity by pointing to Christians who have failed to live consistently with its teachings. History certainly contains example of hypocrisy and abuse. But that's not the real question. The question is this: what kind of world does Christianity naturally produce when its teachings are actually believed and lived? I think we've found out. When we honestly compare civilizations before Christianity, alongside cultures shaped by Christianity and against societies built on competing worldviews, we see a remarkable pattern emerging. See, Christianity didn't invent human beings, but it did change how human beings viewed one another and themselves. Christianity elevated the weak. It protected children. It honored women. It established charity as a moral obligation. It inspired hospitals, orphanages, the abolition movement, universities, and even the very concept that every individual possesses equal worth because each bears the image of God. No, I don't want a world without Christianity. That charge that Christianity has been a net negative for civilization, the historical evidence points precisely in the opposite direction. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who thinks Christianity has only harmed the world. This conversation is too important to let myths replace history. Until next time, I'm Lenny Esposito, and thanks for joining me on Come Let Us Reason Together. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.